real issues. And you've got to present them the way they are, not in full terms or disguised or symbolic terms.
Right.
I mean, he just wrote directly, which is why he's still read by those who have the capacity to read him, who can think out of the box. I'm not saying Manto is for everybody, but those who read him and can appreciate him will continue to read him, regardless of any censorship.
or perhaps watch Manto the film on Netflix, as many are doing.
Many are doing, but the attitude is that Netflix itne log honge. I mean, you've got 100,000 Netflix viewers in Pakistan. That's not a big deal, but you might just end up. I mean, I don't think 100,000 will show up to see the film, but now they might after the so-called ban. I'm not even sure there's a ban. I mean, it's not clear what it is. It's just that it's not being allowed to be released, and the distributors, after the cuts, allegedly are not willing to show it.
And also, so which also, another question I had from the earlier points I picked up. I mean, Manto's narratives and the way he has written about the partition, both in fiction and in non-fiction works. I mean, that challenges the official narratives in both the countries, even in Indian version of...
Why does it, Raza? Because, the narratives of India and Pakistan is that all the killing from the Pakistani point of view was done by the Hindus or the Sikhs. From the Indian official narrative is it was all done by Muslims. He came along and said the greatest tragedy was not even those sort of perpetrators of violence, but the societal breakdown, that they were turned, I mean, they were still human. I mean, what was, Ishwar Singh about? Ishwar Singh still was human enough to be affected by what he had done to the girls, to the girl, and I mean the point, and to his family. So he died. I mean, he kind of he practically died. I mean, so that I think is something that we have to understand, that Manto presented something that was more troubling. It's so much easier to point fingers and say this is the enemy and this is our friend. But the fact is that when he showed human vulnerabilities at a moment of societal crisis, at a moment of societal breakdown, he brought the psychology out. And I think that is not acceptable to the singular narratives of nation states.
Yes. and do you see, I mean, how would you say that this whole idea of nation state and the kind of nationalisms espoused in all three countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, I mean, isn't that also deeply a colonial legacy?
Absolutely. And I can certainly speak on that with great length. I mean, the idea, what we don't realize in this country is that self-determination, we all think, is a very good term. But where does self-determination originate? Some say, oh, it was done by President Wilson, the Wilsonian moment. Well, it's not. I mean, we now know from historical fact. I encourage you to read Mark Mazur, and I think you should invite Mark Mazur to talk about Enchanted Palace, which is about the UN, and he shows quite categorically that the term self-determination was developed by John Smuts, the quintessential imperialist of South Africa, to control, first of all, the black population. Apartheid ka basis hai self-determination. Self-determination's idea was to set up a local ruler over the people, but not, so it was in lieu of democratic freedom. It was to better control. So out of self-determination, and John Smuts was there, League of Nations, he was there for the UN. It's his ideas, not Wilson's. And we know from President Wilson that President Wilson never really intended self-determination for everyone. It was only for special people, and we know what kind of people. So the point is that self-determination was a colonial construct that was aimed at better controlling these people. The interesting thing about Zionism is that Zionism took on this hook, line, and sinker. There was some resistance in other societies, and Muslim societies included, about this, but self-determination is basically a colonial construct. So, but the more important issue is that the colonial state created the spatialization of identities, which said that certain religions are only possible to live in certain territories. Whereas in the earlier period, in the Persian period, for instance, they were not religiously based empires. People moved around, and they were just so long as they were Persian educated, and they had talent of identity, which then led to the nation state. So the nation state is inherently exclusive. As Benedict Anderson famously said, it's an imagined community which is sovereign and thoroughly excluded from the Indian national narrative.
Yeah.
So I think the nation-state form needs to be revisited. I'm not suggesting that we can very easily dump it, but there are certain attitudes that were more appropriate for the colonial period nation states of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is that 70 years later, we haven't got together to discuss whether, what things are in our own best interest. Everything that the colonial masters left, you have adopted, and you are now completely sort of reverential towards. So I think that is the fundamental problem.
Yes, and which then leads to the next question. I mean, do you see that decolonization? I mean, you briefly mentioned that India is passing through a moment. I mean, but I'm not so sure if it's actually decolonization. I see it more as a
kind of decolonization that even we went through during Zia, but it is an incomplete decolonization because even as we have decolonized in a certain way in Pakistan, we have sustained colonial ways of thinking, one of which is of suspicion. The colonial state held the entire society in suspicion, and haven't you noticed the way in which everybody is under suspicion? I mean, I walk into a bank and I'm treated like I'm some kind of a thief unless proven innocent. So everything here is like you're treated like there is and this is a colonial attitude. We've got to get over it. Got to get over it. Everybody's under suspicion.
And which of course then, the idea of a suspicious question here is that the transition or the democratic way because we are going through a transition for more than a decade now. It's the third elected government we have. It is a history in making of sorts because we've never had such a phase in contemporary Pakistani history where you've had one civilian government succeed another. And do you think that transition will help enable?
It's necessary but not sufficient because I don't think democracy is some sort of a magic sort of wand that can be, waved every 4 or 5 years and then you get to another stage. The point is the quality of what you're doing. I mean, you can have the formality of elections, have nothing. I mean, in Pakistan, for a variety of reasons, it has had a different political development. But India has been an unbroken democracy, barring the emergency of Indira Gandhi. And yet, today, we are seeing a closing of space in India, uninterrupted democracy. So Indians are doing this to themselves through democratic, but in India, it is happening through democratic means. And what's happening? I mean, I think Bangladesh is more like Pakistan, but India, how do you explain India? I mean, it has had an unbroken democracy. But why is there closing of space there? I mean, I'll explain to you that this is the end of the Nehruvian legacy. But so they are doing it. But the fact is that democracy is doing it. And I think we need to be careful what we mean by democracy because democracy is not some kind of a grand idea. It is it's an aspiration. It's a constant attempt to strengthen it, and we're going to have the fusion of the narrative in Pakistan. We need to clarify what it is that we are debating. I mean, it's a bit like what I quoted Manto. Are we saying that we are really against progress? Are we really against the right of people to improve their lives or have the sense of freedom? If that is what we are arguing, then yes, we can say that this is a battle between Democrats and anti-Democrats, progressives and non-progressives. But I actually am not convinced that it is that at all. This is about people claiming space by whatever means possible, by whatever. So these are positionalities. People are positioning themselves in an ongoing battle, which is changing contours. But I think the most interesting thing for me as a historian is that it is becoming more and more difficult to control.
Yes,
that is the point.
That certainly is the case, and we saw that in the recent elections. We saw it before that it is no longer an easy project to execute, and which is I think that's a great positive change in Pakistan that I see positive.
Trying to reverse that because they don't want to accept that. So I think that is what is happening with the robust guardians of the nation state. They feel that they can still control or try to. So I think that will take some time to unfold.
Right. Okay. So until the questions come our way, we can start with one. Okay. Okay, some of these, hand them over. Okay, so this question is, Manto's narrative either has highlighted the issue of bourgeois or elite class. What has changed in Pakistan in 7 decades on account of censorship? Manto's writings provide an actual depiction of our society pre-partition as well as later. So who is against literature and why?
I think we answered that. So I'm not quite sure what I can add to this point. But I mean, it's those who feel that they are in charge of controlling thought processes, or those who occupy positions, who feel that they are obliged to do that. In this instance, it could just be the censor board, who felt that these things were excessive, and it may not be anything more than that. So I think that that is what, but I think that it is an attitude that has to be thought about a little bit more carefully. Are we really